Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Pixels in Progress podcast, where we talk about sexism in gaming. Today I'm here with Dr. Paul. Dr. Paul, please introduce yourself with your preferred pronouns, your gender identity, and a few of the games you like to play, or the types of games you like to play.
Okay. My name is Chris Paul. I have a PhD from University of Minnesota in rhetoric, and I choose to study video games. I like video games a lot. My pronouns are he, him. I am cisgender. Some games that I like. Growing up, I played a ton of Final Fantasy. That was a very important series to me. The game series that I probably played the most of is World of Warcraft. Now I have kids, so I'm playing different kinds of games and playing a lot of mobile games that align with a research project that I recently did. So right now I'm playing a lot of Marvel Snap. I've got NBA 2K on the console, and I enjoy playing Splatoon with the kids.
First question is, can you just share a specific personal experience where you encountered sexism in the gaming world while gaming, and how did you handle it?
I don't personally experience a ton of sexism because I'm a cis white guy. So that when I see it, it's more it being meted out on other people. So it's about, for me, it's about being supportive to my colleagues that may not be white men, and making sure that I hold other white men accountable for the kinds of things that they do. So that came up a fair chunk when we played Warcraft, World of Warcraft, and we were playing in mixed gender groups, and we made sure that any guys that played with us were in a situation where they understood that they were also playing with women and they needed to treat them with respect. At the time, it was pretty striking that, like a lot of women didn't like to speak on voice chat even back then, which is like you're talking like 15, 20 years ago, because once they did, they were treated much differently than they would be otherwise. So building a good group from the beginning and making sure that people had a space where they could feel free to express themselves and not be harassed. I think it's important for folks like me to call it out.
Mhm. So, when you've witnessed sexism in gaming, what was a method that worked to help combat sexism and kind of shut down that behavior?
Well, I think it takes a variety of different approaches. The first thing you do is hopefully you build a community from the beginning, where folks agree and are opting into a situation where they realize that they're going to be playing with people who are different than they are, and they need to respect those people uh, as people and players. And then when events occur, you need to note them, you need to call them out, and you need to talk about them, and you need to talk about why that behavior is not acceptable. Hopefully, you come from a place of trying to educate somebody and make the situation better. One like beyond sexism in gaming, one of the big experiences that I had early too was we raided with at the time we were raiding with one of the most prominent out gay guilds in World of Warcraft. So there was a lot of homophobic talk that needed to be worked through as well, because it's not just sexism in gaming; homophobia can run rampant too. So making sure that folks knew that when you use homophobic or sexist slurs, it impacts the people around us, and we need to do better. It was also sometimes helpful that one of the women in our guild was a mom, and for whatever reason, that's the intersection of gender and age dynamics. Some of the younger men that would say rude things when she wasn't around would would be more respectful with her in the room. Now, they shouldn't need her to be there, but did give us a chance to talk about age and sexism and the way that you need to behave around other people to make sure that we're fostering the right environment. And then, worst comes to worst, if people aren't improving their behavior, getting rid of them so that we can make sure that we've got the community that we want and enforcing the norms that we expect in the group that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was really interesting that their behavior kind of changed based on who was present in the team. Like with the mom being there, how like age especially changes the way people talk about each other.
Oh, for sure. Because so like the sexism would come up with younger women largely because they were either made fun of or they were approached as potentially a sexual target, right? But the mom of a fellow player coded completely differently. So because she played with her son and they were both there, it completely changed the dynamic of how they interacted with each other and with her in the room, because they kind of had to, and they knew that the behavior had to clean up somewhat. Um, but at the same time, it shouldn't take a mom in the room for people to be decent and respectful. So that if they weren't, we needed to have a conversation about it. And if they didn't shape up, it was the right move to get rid of them.
I was gonna ask, like, did their behavior go back to being toxic as soon as the mom left the environment?
Times it everybody was on their best behavior when she was around. At the same time, it's a question of what it goes back to, right? And like if you're among your friends, you can engage like close friends, you can engage in a different kind of banter than you can in a mixed group. But at the time in World of Warcraft, you're talking about groups of 40 people, so you're going to necessarily have a heterogeneous group with different kinds of people with you, which means that you need to be respectful. And if you're not, you need to find another group because ours wasn't the one for you.
I have another question here about representation in the games themselves, and
Sure.
it was to pick a particular game or character that resonated with you because of its positive portrayal of gender or gender diversity and why it was meaningful to you or why you thought it did a better job at representation than other video games.
I think it's not great and it's got its own problems, but I think the Mass Effect series was really interesting, and that the Mass Effect series is one of the first ones that I remember where like you chose at the beginning your character, and you could either choose a female or a male character. Now they were still engendered in certain kinds of ways, and it's problematic. We just swap out the gender and we have the same character. But it was also notable that like it is widely accepted that the female character has the better voice actor, and I thought that that was an interesting way of dabbling with in relatively older game times, the idea of representation, how things can look different. There are plenty of problems, but I think that that choice and that agency to be able to do something different, and have the female version be the far superior version, was an interesting moment.
How about when looking at storylines or, yeah, I guess like storylines and dialogue and voice lines?
Sure.
Um,
Like I think the key is creating full characters with rich backstories that like are actual people as opposed to like agents to move the plot forward. I think there was a really troublesome term around Bioshock Infinite and the original Last of Us, where we get all these daughter characters that aren't fully fleshed out and that aren't robots. They're just kind of there to often to be saved,
mhm.
and it's kind of, that's not really what I'm looking for, right? That's inclusion that's not robust, and that's an inclusion that's not complete. But including characters of all races, genders, and identities in more dynamic ways is going to serve games better going forward, just like it is in other forms of entertainment. I'm interested to see what this new Grand Theft Auto game does,
Yes, me
because
too.
Grand Theft Auto 6, yeah, it's going to be like I'm interested to see what they do, because that's been a game that's been regressive for a long time, and we're going to have our first female protagonist in the game, and I'm interested how that's coded, right? And one of the things about representation is that the characters don't all have to be good, right? Like one of the coolest things when representation is met is that you get characters that aren't heroes, that are women or people of color. So like, is this character going to be a fully fleshed out version of a Grand Theft Auto anti-hero who happens to be a woman? I think that's interesting. I don't have a lot of faith, but I think it's interesting.
When looking at the intersectionality of sexism in gaming and in character representation, how do you think factors of intersectionality contribute to the experiences of marginalized individuals?
Like the research indicates that it contributes massively, right? Like, but it also means that oftentimes when they're playing mass market games, they have to turn parts of them off, or parts of themselves off. Like from what I read and in my experience in chatting with gamers that have more diverse and differentiated parts of their identity than I do, it's a situation where like they're often asked to choose between parts of themselves in order to play the game that they're playing, or turn off parts of themselves. I don't face that. It's also notable that like when we do have these moments where characters of color are put in the center, white gamers often throw a fit, which speaks almost even more to like the homogeneity of games and the regressiveness of representation in games. Like there's the example of Rust when characters couldn't pick their race. White gamers freaked out because they might have to play as a gamer of color. In The Witcher, we have no characters of color in the Witcher series, because the developers say there were no characters of color in the medieval Poland that they're doing, but like they're focused on dragons and magic and all that stuff, which also didn't exist. So I think that oftentimes gamer players are put in a position where they're asked to choose parts of themselves, and we, like myself as a white guy, I don't face that, and that's a shame, because I think that being in a position where you're a little decentered and a little pushed into something that may be slightly uncomfortable for you is where you learn. And I wish more players were open to that.
Hmm.
More white players were open to that, white male players.
This makes me think of the character selection for Valorant. They have a pretty diverse selection, I feel like, with like such a variety of places of origin, and they give them pretty complex lore about their origin. And I think some players are inclined to pick the agents that me, for example, I am Chinese and Sage is Chinese, and I was like, oh wow, it's really cool to see a Chinese character in the game, and she's like such an asset to the team. And I loved playing her for a while. And but some gamers, I feel like, also expect like if you're a girl, you're gonna play the girl, you're gonna play the support character, you're gonna play the healer. So I don't want to perpetuate those stereotypes, but also I like choosing the agents that I can relate to and identify with.
Yeah, that's part of what I was talking about. Like you're put in a position as to have to make far more weighty and complex choices than I am, and that sucks, right? And until we get to a situation where there's better balance and there's better representation across the board, and you can play the character you want to play without having to think about the sexist representation of a woman playing in a support role, like it's a shame that that's where we're at, and I hope that we get out of that at some point. I'm not sure that I see exactly the path there, but I do think there are games that have more elements of representations. I do think that there are games that are doing more complex things, and I think that game companies are finding that there is a substantial chunk of the player base that wants to play those games. So there's money in it for them too. I think that the game industry as a whole tends to be very small c conservative because games take so long to develop and cost so much money that they often end up giving us more of what we've had rather than the kinds of things that we could imagine. And I hope we get more of those things that we can imagine, and that those things are shown to be successful, so that like the I believe relatively smaller but incredibly vocal portion of the fan base for games that is incredibly problematic, that they're not the center of the discussion anymore, and we could talk about all of the people that want to play in all of the ways they want to play.
Speaking of the role of gaming companies and developers, what role do you think they play in addressing sexism within the industry? And are there specific initiatives or policies that you can think of that have proven to be effective?
I think they play a big one. I think that game design matters both in terms of like the way that you actually build your games and then the characters you choose to represent. And I think the way that you go about that matters. I think that who you have at the table in development matters. And we have case after case of stories of developers having incredibly problematic working environments. Everything from just like relatively routine, this is a problematic working environment, to endemic sexism, racism, and harassment. And I think as long as we continue to have overwhelming number of people working in game companies that are white guys, you're only going to have so much progress, even if many of those white guys are trying to make games better. We need to have a more robust group of people making games, and we will get a more robust group of games as a result. And until we get that, it's going to be a problem. I think there are massive problems with existing reporting systems, and I think that it's on a variety of different levels. One of the problems with existing reporting systems is that they just don't work well enough, that they don't deter behavior and they don't show obvious responses to consequences. Like League of Legends has tried a bunch of things over a long period of time, and they really haven't made a substantial dent in what's out there. I think that one of the things that game companies have been loath to do, but I think that they need to think about, is how you educate the people on the other side, the people who have been harassed, that things are actually getting better. And how do you show them that they actually took action on the report? Because there's a perverse incentive for those companies to not really take a lot of action on the report, and effectively then they can report out that, hey, report the number of total reports went down because everybody's lost faith in the system. I think that that's been a huge problem for Xbox, especially over time, and they're debuting some new stuff, but it's still the number of strikes you can get before you actually have a real consequence is massive. So I think that there needs to be fewer strikes, there needs to be quicker action, and there needs to be some visibility into, if I file a report, that something actually happened. If you don't close that loop and let the people who have been hurt know what's actually going on, and you don't have to tell them everything, but letting them and reassuring them that you're doing something about it, something that matters, like you're gonna have a problematic community for a long time. People need to have faith in the system in order to continue to participate in it, and participate in it in good faith. And if they lose that faith and trust in the system, it's a problem. And I don't think most players have very much faith and trust in the existing systems. So we need to do better.
Do you think the role of streaming and content creation platforms have amplified or helped address sexism when certain streamers experience it live on stream and they try to combat it themselves?
It's a really good question that I haven't thought a ton about. I think that there are certain situations where like streaming can perpetuate it, right? Because a fair chunk of the biggest streamers are also like pretty tied to sexism and endemic problems with harassment in the first place. So, I think that some streamers, that especially women and people of color and people with historically marginalized identities, them educating about how they go about dealing with it can provide a roadmap for other people, but they also surface like that this happens in the first place. So I'm not sure how I feel about that exactly, and it shouldn't necessarily be just on them. I do think that one of the things that some streams can show is like we are going to create this community where we have specific norms about being decent human beings to each other, regardless of your identity. And if you're not into that, just find something else. And that those communities can be really robust and really interesting and really supportive and a nice home for people who want that sort of thing. So I do think there's something going on there. I'm not exactly sure what it is.
All right, I think I'm going to conclude our podcast on this final question. I guess just as advice for the audience. But how can allies or just bystanders play a more active role in supporting those who face sexism in the gaming community?
Support each other, check in on each other, um, call out and talk about harassment when it occurs so that it can be dealt with. One of the things, there's an essay that I talk about in class that I think is pretty interesting, has an interesting anecdote in it. And it's a writer from The Guardian talking about an experience playing games. And she talks about the fact that that she talked on voice chat after a while. And then somebody else in the voice chat was like, I thought you were a guy. And somebody else was like, I'm a woman too. I thought you were a guy. And it turns out everyone in this gaming group was a woman that had thought everyone else was a guy. And it's one of those moments where like we often internalize the problems on ourselves and then we perpetuate those issues. So that I think creating spaces and moments where we can be open with each other and participate in the games that we want to play with a group of people that we want to play with is really good. And then making sure that we build those communities that can be supportive of each other and hold up when challenged. So that people that just want to play games and they want to play games with other people who are down to support them. That's the kind of spaces we want to build, and I hope that game companies do a better game of weeding out toxicity and harassment, so that we can have more experiences of fun and joy together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Paul, for coming on. What are two games that you would recommend to our audience?
So I'll give you one that I'm playing right now and one that I can't wait to play, but I haven't gotten around to yet. The one that I'm playing right now is Warcraft Rumble. It just came out for mobile devices, and it's a little bit like Clash Royale in the Warcraft universe with a more robust player versus environment mode, a PvE mode. So I'm really interested in that. That's been a lot of fun and taking up way too much of my time. The game that I'm interested in playing that I haven't gotten around to, but I'm hoping to do this weekend is Dave the Diver. Just came out on the Switch, and I'm interested in playing that. You're a scuba diver slash chef that like catches stuff and then cooks it later at dinner. I think my partner might like it a lot, so I'm excited to check that out, and I'm hoping to get to it this weekend.
Oh my gosh, my boyfriend has Dave the Diver, and he highly recommends it to me all the time.
Yeah, good. I've heard wonderful things.